throughout this conference, there's been a sense of optimism about the emerging Asian century. How do you feel about that sense of optimism?
Well, I don't know if it's going to solve the problems we're facing, but I think it's a realization of the shift that's taking place in terms of the global economy, really. And when you talk about the Asian century, again, it's different people mean different things by that. So if you think about the panel we had this morning with the representatives of the Australian government, for instance, the white paper on Asia that's being written at the government right now. Now, people coming from that background, not just in Australia, but in various other countries, in Europe or in the US for that matter, when they're talking about the Asian century, they are recognizing the fact that there are 3 or 4 Asian economies, notably China, India, increasingly Indonesia, and obviously to some extent Thailand and Malaysia as well, are growing so fast that in terms of their share of the world economy, it's going to be dramatically larger than anything we've seen before, even before the rise of Europe in the modern period. So yes, countries like China and India were dominant in the world economy, say 400 years ago, but not on a scale that they are going to be now. And I think that shift is what they are thinking about. But, and it has some very material consequences, like the growth of very large middle classes in these Asian societies, which means that they have this huge ability to consume resources and goods and services, which other economies wish to provide and benefit by providing. But it, for people like us who are scholars of Asia, I think the optimism is that the rise to prominence of Asia in the understanding and experience of especially the industrialized world or the European and American world means that the kind of societies and questions we study will have greater relevance in the academy, that higher education will find it more interesting and more necessary to know more about these parts of the world, which is something we care about, and we've been arguing forever that you should be taking Asia more seriously, and now people will take Asia more seriously. And as I was saying in my comments today in this panel that I was just speaking at, it's also coming from within these societies. So it's not just people living in Europe or America looking out and looking at Asia changing so rapidly, but it's also coming from within, in that people of Asian heritage, people have had some connection with Asia in the past, who live in Europe or who live in North America, are also optimistic and also excited about this change, and are putting pressure in their own societies to learn more, to have more understanding, to have more instruction in this part of the world. So I think so for each of these groups, the optimism means something slightly different, but they all recognize this common process that's going around the world of simply a bunch of Asian societies becoming a very much bigger part of the world economy.
As someone who studies the environment, have you been concerned about a lack of focus in this conference about this issue?
My concern, since I work on those questions, is the problems may get aggravated in the short run because these fast-growing economies, which are not only growing fast, they're growing probably 10 times as fast as any economy grew in the past. And a lot of it is not just the growth itself, but the rate and speed of growth. So when you have the demand for natural resources, going up 20-fold or 50-fold in the space of 20 years, the environmental consequences of that can be devastating. And we already see that. What are the biggest issues in Asia today? They are shortages of fresh water, there are shortages of agricultural land, there are arable, good cultivable land, there are shortages of minerals, And these fast-growing Asian societies may well reproduce the kinds of difficulties we saw in the 18th and 19th century when the fast-growing European societies went all over the world to grab up the resources that they needed for their own development. And you might find that China and India and all begin to do that on a much more devastating scale in the short run. But I say short run because the one big difference between the 19th century and the 21st century is that our technological capabilities to understand and propose solutions to some of the big environmental problems are vastly superior now. And whether think of alternative sources of energy or ways to reduce the ecological footprint of various kinds of human activity, we know a lot more and we have many more options. But will we pick those options? Will we invest in them? These are all political questions. And will the governments make the right decisions remain to be seen, which is why I say we don't know the problems can be solved. I don't think we will miss out because of lack of knowledge or lack of technological capability. We might miss out because of lack of political acuity and shall I say, certain kinds of commitments to the environment, commitments to sustainability, commitments to environmental justice. That is, you don't want to get rich at the expense of the degradation of the environment in which poor people have to live. You don't want to enjoy certain kinds of lifestyles by risking the future of the next generations to follow. And so those kinds of questions of environmental justice, these are moral and ethical questions. How we answer them remains to be seen.
Can you tell us some of the differences in area studies or Asian studies between, say, the United States and Australia?
I've been learning a lot about that since, as I mentioned, this is my first visit to this conference and for that matter to Australia. And that's why I was eager to come to learn about these kinds of differences that you are asking about. And from what little I've seen and learned, the differences are, there are some striking differences. And one thing I learned was clearly there's a lot more thought and effort coming perhaps from the higher levels of government to recognize that Asian studies needs to grow, needs to be supported, and so on. But there may not be corresponding interest and support, say, within the corporate sector or industry, or even with the higher levels of university administrations, which probably are anxious that this might be diverting resources from things that they care about. In the US, I would say the government has been slower to take the lead on these things, whereas the top universities and the private sector, the corporate sector, are very keen to see this happen. They want more expertise on Asia developed in the education system, and they're investing in it. And there's also a larger base of support within society. So wealthy people in society are making donations to the universities they care about and saying, build these new programs of study. So I don't think there's such a strong base or culture of philanthropic investment in higher education here, which is, I think, similar to, say, the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe. So those forces have to be stimulated here probably, because that's where the solutions will come. And in a sense, Asian studies is growing and strong and thriving in the US, despite, I would say, the lack of attention on the part of the government, because society and the private industry and the universities themselves seem to care about it a lot more. And here, the government seems to be concerned about it, but others may be falling behind. That's the sense I got from hearing some of the discussions here.
One of the issues that has emerged has been the fact that liberal arts is growing at universities throughout Asia while simultaneously declining in Western universities. What do you think are some of the implications about this?
I wouldn't say the liberal arts are declining across the West. I would differentiate between, say, certain parts of the North American higher education system where the liberal arts continue to flourish, whereas in other parts, like some of the public universities are suffering and it's declining. If you look at Europe, I think Germany is doing very well, whereas the United Kingdom, there is a noticeable decline in liberal arts. But yes, on the whole, after all, liberal arts education was largely invented in the modern West, in Europe, in England, and in America later. And America became sort of the the exemplar of it. And when you look at that heyday, which probably lasted through the first 3 quarters of the 20th century, things may not look so great, but still pretty strong there. But what is indeed very encouraging to see, and I agree, I share Lily's optimism on this, is that there is an interest in liberal arts across several Asian countries, where actually the education system has been such that they have never been known to take an interest. The whole system was designed in a way that people got tracked very early into studying one or the other subject, as early as in their final years of high school. And then it was very hard to break out of that. You became science or arts or commerce or something in 10th grade, and that's what you did through college, and that was it. Whereas that's beginning to change, but on a very small scale as yet. And I think that's an encouraging sign, because when that happens, as we know from the experience especially of North America, that this can lead to a new generation of educated people who think more openly, who think more creatively, who are more willing to challenge tradition and challenge received wisdom and innovate and so on. Because basically what liberal arts does is to cultivate the spirit of a questioning spirit in young people from the age of 17 or 18, and encourage them to be creative and bold and interdisciplinary and problem focused in the way they acquire knowledge. And the hope is that that kind of an educated group will also emerge within these Asian societies where liberal arts education was never really a part of their educational tradition. And it's an optimistic thought. And I think there is definitely interest. I know best about India, and I'm struck by every time I'm in India, I'm meeting some new person who is investing in starting a liberal arts college or a university and is looking to the best examples, whether it's small liberal arts colleges like Wellesley College or Swarthmore College, one of the top ones, or a university like Princeton, and saying we want to do something like that. And that's amazing, because I grew up in India till the age of, till I was in my late 20s, I lived there. And it's unbelievable how hard it was to persuade people there to study 2 different things. If you chose physics, that's what you did. If you chose history, that's all you did. And the idea that people might actually want to do liberal arts, to me, is very encouraging.
I heard this really amazing documentary comparing the rise of India and the rise of China.
Yeah.
And they were talking about how, they were sort of, in a way, it was leaning towards this idea that, if you want to build they were talking about one of the strengths and weaknesses of India is the democratic
Yes.
nature,
Correct.
And then at the end, they were talking about how one of the strengths of the Chinese system is that, sometimes if you want to build something, you just go ahead and build it.
You do it, yes.
Yeah, and they were saying, that kind of feeds this economic machine. But they were saying, and then this reporter ended up in India, in China, and he said, but when you go to it, when you look at it, who is teaching the Chinese about computers, programming, so that, and it was the Indians,
Yeah.
It was there, and he was kind of saying there is this kind of messiness in the system that works, and I think it's that messiness that the liberal arts offer,
Yes, I mean, if you look historically, as I always say this to people who are talking to me about this, is if you look at the time when, say, England was dominant in the world, which is basically the 19th century. If you look at the time when America, the United States was dominant in the world, which is basically the second half of the 20th century, what was distinctive about these societies? They had the finest systems of higher education. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge were the 2 finest universities in the world when England was at the top of the heap. And now there's a whole bunch of such universities in America. There's probably 20 such universities which are of the caliber of Oxford and Cambridge, and they are at the top of the heap ever since, I would say, this First World War. And that's what made these societies so successful, that they had this strong liberal arts tradition, and they were producing an educated elite who grabbed leadership positions in their societies based on this fine education that they got. And I think these Asian societies which are emerging now and are seeing themselves as members of this Asian century, the future leaders of the world, are learning that lesson. And they want to build universities of that caliber in China, in India, in Indonesia, in Singapore, and so on. And they'll probably do it in the next 15 to 20 years. Even China is interested in liberal arts education now, and is trying to recruit people from all over America and so on, and have them come and teach at these universities. So I would say it wouldn't be probably too long before they don't need Indians to come and teach them programming. Their own young graduates will begin to do that.